As my colleague Kevin Richards said, my name is Chris Wilson. I'm the Vice President and Counsel for Communications, Privacy, and Internet Policy at TechAmerica. It's quite a mouthful, but I'm so happy to be here and introduce the second panel we have today to speak about spectrum allocation and rural development and mobile broadband age. I'll do a quick brief just introduction of their name and title, and I'll let each panelist perhaps provide a 30-second overview of their background to elucidate you all. But I think it's important to note the context. Obviously, this program was put together, it was being put together before Congress had actually passed its watershed spectrum legislation last week, so it's appropriate for us to be having this discussion now. As you heard from former Congressman Boucher and Jonathan Edelstein, the government has done a lot with Congress and RUS, Department of Commerce, others, on this issue. I think it's important also to hear what the private sector has done and will be doing with regard to broadband deployment, especially mobile broadband deployment. So I think we have a lot to learn today. So to my immediate right is Pete Eyrig, Senior Vice President of CGI. Pete will speak to the impact of broadband development on job creation in rural areas. To his right is Philip Junker. He's the Executive Director of Strategic Alliances for Verizon Wireless, and will speak to what Verizon Wireless is doing with the smaller carriers in rural areas and deploying our rural broadband, mobile broadband services. And then to his right is Dr. Anna Maria Kovac. She's a visiting senior policy scholar at the Center of Business and Public Policy at the McDonough School of Business at Georgetown University. Anyone that's been following the technology industry for years has no doubt seen her name in a variety of contexts. She's very well informed in a lot of these discussions, so we thank them all for being here. So, Pete.
Sure, just to introduce myself, Pete Eyrig at CGI. CGI is a global information technology company. We provide services to commercial clients, state clients, and federal clients in the U.S. and around the world. About $4.3 billion company, about 10,000 people in the U.S. providing software and technology services to clients. In our U.S. headquarters here in Northern Virginia, has been for 30 years. I lead all of CGI's business in the south and central part of the United States. So that's my introduction.
Good morning, I'm Philip Junker, and I'm with Verizon Wireless. I work on Spectrum Matters, buying and selling various spectrum bands, and I lead our LTE in Rural America program, which I'm going to describe a little bit later today.
I'm Anna Maria Kovacs. I have spent roughly 30 years following this industry, most of it as an analyst covering the telecommunications area, and most of the last decade that I was doing that, covering the regulatory landscape. And since I retired from that, I have been at the Center for Business and Public Policy at Georgetown, and one of the things I particularly appreciate about the center is that it does try to bring together the business perspective with the public policy perspective, and those are very often two very different ways of looking at the world. So one of the things and one of the headers you always find on my papers is regulation and financial translation, because I think it is tremendously important for the folks who make public policy to understand the financial implications of what they do.
Okay,
Not sure which of us is going to start. Go, please.
I'm going to give you a perspective from the user, if you will, of a lot of these services. So when you hear people talk about, well, we need to create jobs in rural America, high-tech jobs, we're the ones that are creating those high-tech jobs. So it's very important what we're talking about today for our business to be able to get access to that facility and to create those jobs in rural America. So first, I'd like to say thank you to Chairman Boucher and Administrator Edelstein for all their support for driving broadband to rural America, because it's incredibly important to my industry and the information technology industry. And so, like many IT companies, CGI uses a global delivery model around the world that balances offshore, onshore, and rural shore to provide IT services for our clients. In anticipation of our clients' desire for IT resources closer to home and at a competitive price, we added a U.S. onshore delivery component as a core element of our business model. Utilizing existing U.S. broadband investments and government incentive programs, we established IT service delivery centers in smaller U.S. communities that basically deliver really high-quality services, have really great talent that we can tap into. It improves the competitiveness of our company in the IT services industry, which is very competitive. Expands our access to that broad base of talent beyond major universities and major metropolitan areas. And I think very importantly, it invigorates the local economies where we put these centers, because they are providing white-collar jobs for college graduates coming right out of smaller universities that would have to probably move away in order to pursue their career. So the first of these onshore centers we opened in 2006, and it opened in Lebanon, Virginia, and Russell County. The decision to locate our first center in Southwest Virginia was based on several factors, but most importantly on the availability of and the access to high-speed broadband capability. And I want to acknowledge the critical role that Chairman Boucher played in bringing this technology to Southwest Virginia. It was certainly central to our decision to come to Lebanon, Virginia, so I'd like to thank everybody involved in that. The key factors in our decision to locate in Southwest Virginia were a couple of things. First and foremost, did it have the technology infrastructure, the broadband infrastructure to support, being able to have high-tech employees that can tap into the global grid 24/7. That's table stakes. And if it wasn't for that, we could not have located a technology center there. The other one is geography. So the location Southwest Virginia affords central access to many of our U.S. Clients in the east and central part of the U.S. There's 5 states within a 30-minute drive and an international airport 45 minutes away. We also had access to a talent pool. There's over 30 colleges and universities within a 100-mile radius of Southwest Virginia. In addition, Russell County, in partnership with the regional academic community, invested heavily in building new facilities and developing local technical training programs targeting specifically at staff development needs of large IT companies like CGI. It also provided a business-friendly climate. Virginia has created an environment that fosters pretty much unprecedented cooperation among local, county, and state agencies. Benefits to CGI included attractive economic incentives and direct access to academic, political, and business tools and resources. Also, the cost of living. With a 2005 median income of $29,000 and a median home price of $94,000, Southwest Virginia region afforded an overall cost of living index that is below the national average, allowing CGI to attract talent and deliver services to its clients at a price point 20 to 30% lower than that of a major metropolitan area. That's a competitive differentiator. So it doesn't all have to go to India. If you can tap into this, this provides a great way to provide a competitive differentiation. But first and foremost, what brought us to Southwest Virginia was the access to the appropriate technology, as I mentioned. At the turn of the 21st century, Russell County's coal mining economy was in the midst of an unemployment crisis. From 1993 to 2004, the region saw a 20% loss of jobs. Coal mining lost 29.4% of its employees. Manufacturing and tobacco production also showed sharp declines. The median age in the area rose sharply as young adults fled the area for jobs and livable wages elsewhere. However, with the foresight of Chairman Boucher and others, Russell County's visionary plan for attracting 21st century development and support from the Commonwealth, a new telecommunications network built on a fiber optic backbone became a reality. The region secured funding from the U.S. Commerce Department's Economic Development Agency, as well as an additional grant from the Virginia Tobacco Indemnification and Community Revitalization Commission. So for CGI, broadband availability and capacity were essential location factors. Again, for me, it's table stakes. If it wasn't there, there would be no high-tech jobs there. We just couldn't put them there. The high-speed fiber optic backbone that serves the town of Lebanon and Russell County is the result of a cooperative effort between Bristol, Virginia Utilities, and the Cumberland Plateau Planning District Commission. The Bristol, Virginia Utilities constructed the fiber optic backbone, extending its line from Abington to Lebanon and Russell County, and running through the heart of the business technology park where our facility is located. We moved into the new Southwest Virginia IT Center for Excellence in January 2006, with 300 employees delivering software development, application testing, systems integration, and application support to a range of commercial and government clients. Today, we have more than 420 people there, high-tech jobs in rural America. Our success in Southwest Virginia proved that our model for onshore delivery worked and precipitated development and opening of 2 additional centers, one in Troy, Alabama, and one, our newest one, in Belton, Texas. We now have commitments for more than 1,000 employees in these locations. As was the case for Southwest Virginia, our innovative community investment model is driven by the community's business environment, access to quality workforce, and engaged local government and academic partnerships. We leverage existing broadband infrastructure and programs at the federal, state, and local level that provides grants and other incentives to mitigate startup costs, and in turn, CGI makes hiring and training commitments. We project that when fully staffed, our centers will generate over $200 million in annual economic activity. This model works because it's good for our clients, it's good for our company, it makes us competitive, and it's good for the country. It really is a win-win-win. And there's probably 2 things I really want you to take away from this. One is the broadband availability in these rural centers it's table stakes. If those things were not there in those communities, like Troy, like Belton, like Lebanon, there was no way. I'd be the poster child of that executive that got off the plane like, my phone doesn't work. Well, why would I even try to put a high-tech center here? Because I have to connect the center 24/7 to the global network that we have. And so it is absolute necessity. It's not a nice to have, it's a has to have. And so if you don't have that, the high-tech jobs are not going to be in that location. I think the other big thing that from my perspective, in being part of a company that's creating these jobs and utilizing all this stuff is, and I have the privilege to talk to a lot of governors because everybody wants a high-tech center in their state. And I try to tell people, listen, you've got to think about it from my perspective, from the industry perspective, from the IT industry perspective. The biggest natural resource that we use, the raw material that we use in my industry is the human mind. That's it. You know, so that is the one natural resource that every state has. You know, well, states are very proud of all the natural resources they have, you know, timber and oil and coal and lots of different stuff. You've got to think about the human mind as one of the most precious natural resources. And it's the only natural resource that you have that can get up and move out of state on its own. Because when those kids come out of college, out of community college or out of local universities, and they're interested in getting into the technology field, do they have to move away to get into it? They will. They will move to wherever the jobs are, wherever that community of technology people are, wherever they're going to feel their career prospects are. So you've got to approach this both from a business standpoint, a political standpoint, academic standpoint, local government, state government, federal government, of how do I use those natural resources here? We have to give them, we have to collectively give them the reason to stay where they grew up. And that is going to be great for the country, it's going to be great for the local economies, and it's great for business, because I need that competitive differentiation. We can put those jobs anywhere in the world. Anywhere I can have a mind and a broadband connection, that job can go to. That's the world we live in now. But I think there's a huge opportunity if you can really continue this path of developing the broadband access and that partnership between all the elements. I think the rural shore strategy is a winner. And so I'd like to thank everyone, and Chairman Boucher and Administrator Iddleston for all that they've done. And we are very proud to be part of the solution at CGI, both as a business and as citizens. We think it's the right thing to do. Thank you.
I'll press, oh, you have I'll go ahead and talk a little bit about, we heard a very compelling argument about why broadband resources in rural markets are important. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what Verizon is doing to make that vision a reality. Many of you are aware that we're very aggressive in launching 4G LTE. We launched our network in December of 2010 and have since grown to serve over 200 million Americans in that very short time, with technology that offers 5 to 12 megabits per second in the downlink and 2 to 5 in the uplink with very low latency. So this is truly mobile broadband service being offered very aggressively throughout the United States. By the end of 2013, we will have expanded our 4G LTE service to cover everywhere we have service today, which includes a substantial number of rural counties. Verizon is, I believe, the largest rural carrier in the United States. I came to Verizon from Alltel, which was a small rural operator based in Arkansas, and I've been with Verizon since that acquisition in 2009. So I do want to reference a handout that will be available at the back at the end of the conference. So our 4G rollout has been very aggressive, but even after covering all of the footprint we have today, there will still be areas of the country that don't have the benefit of Verizon 4G service. And so the LTE in Rural America program, which was launched in June of 2010, is designed to partner with rural carriers based in lower density areas in the United States to help them bring 4G service to their markets quickly and efficiently. So we've reached out with, we think, a very innovative model to attract investment and broadband development in these markets. As you may know, Verizon Wireless has a nationwide spectrum license in the 700 upper C spectrum. Now, we've historically been a very efficient user of spectrum, and we think of ourselves as good stewards of that spectrum. So what we did was to go out to rural operators and offer to lease them all 22 megahertz of the spectrum in that upper C available in their communities outside our current footprint. This kind of access to spectrum was very important as they thought about their 4G deployment. So that was the first step, leasing them spectrum. But we realized that carriers needed scale across their entire business model in order to compete in the modern broadband world. So we also offered them the ability to hook into our IP core network, which is really at the heart of our 4G system. So they were given the spectrum for a lease. They were able to build the radio network themselves, often taking advantage of many of the funding mechanisms that were described earlier from the RUS and other sources. And then they connect those wireless cell sites to our core network for a per megabyte charge that really converts what would have been a very large capital expenditure on their part into a risk-adjusted per megabyte variable expense. They were able to take advantage of our scale in buying the cell sites. They are able to take advantage of other services that we can provide them, over-the-air provisioning of customers' SIM cards, and so forth. And in that way, they were able to bring 4G to market quickly and more efficiently with a scaled business model. This was very attractive to wireless carriers. We've had over 300 inquiries around the country from carriers interested in participating in our program. Of course, we're only able to offer it at this time to carriers who are outside of our footprint. So that is a limited number of operators. But we have signed up 15 operators to date in a number of states across the country. In fact, we've leased territory just about the size of the state of Minnesota. And we cover 2.7 million people with our leases in very, very low density markets. So the FCC defines rural, of course, as 100 people per square mile or less. The mean density of the markets that we have leased so far under the program is 30. And we have carriers with density under 1 in many cases. So we are talking about very, very sparsely populated areas that are going to have access to 4G LTE much quicker than otherwise possible. So a little bit about where we do operate. We have leases in Idaho, Utah, 2 in Oklahoma, 2 in Missouri, 2 in Iowa, 1 in Wisconsin, 1 in Michigan, 2 in Indiana, 2 in Kentucky, as well as a portion of West Virginia, and then also in North Carolina. And I can tell you we have many more leases pending. There's great excitement about the program. Most importantly, we are poised to launch with 2 of our operators within several months. So we actually have active LTE networks in Oklahoma, Wisconsin, and Kentucky that are processing traffic, going through testing, and will be ready to launch very, very soon. So we are converting the vision of 4G LTE in rural America into reality later this year. I can also tell you to be on the lookout for additional announcements of leases. And I would ask each of you, if you know of carriers in your community that operate outside the Verizon Wireless footprint, we are open for business. We will continue to lease spectrum in areas that are available as long as necessary. And I would encourage you to contact me if you have carriers that might be interested in the program. So with that, I want to make sure you have some time as well.
Thank you very much, Philip. One of the things that these 2 gentlemen, I think, have made clear is that developing broadband, wireless or wired, and all of its potential is going to require a tremendous amount of private capital. The government has invested a lot, as both the Congressman and Administrator Edelstein, who's kind enough to be with us, still have pointed out. But most of the investment that has gone into building networks does come from private capital. And the spectrum that Congress has made available provides a tremendous opportunity to increase broadband by the kind of factor that Chairman Boucher was talking about earlier, the need to increase capacity by 25 to 50 times in 5 years. That requires a combination of spectrum and private investment. The wireless industry accounts for about 24% of the capital that the ICT industry as a whole puts out. It spends about $3 for every incremental dollar of revenue, and to put it in specific numbers, it invested $26 billion during 2010, which is the last year when we had all of the industry numbers. But my expectation is that that has continued in 2011, and if anything, will even expand. There is a limit, however, with the to the extent that a company can leverage the spectrum it has simply by throwing capital at it. And what I think is tremendously important, and this is what I'll be focusing on primarily in my remarks, is to make sure that the auctions of the spectrum put spectrum in the hands of companies that have subscribers whose desire for bandwidth is increasing enormously year by year as they use more smartphones, more video, do new applications, distance learning, healthcare, jobs. There's no part of life anymore that you really can do without the internet, without access, and mobile access is what seems to be what most people want. So one of the things that I've done, and there was a paper on the Georgetown website for any of you that want to see some of the statistics or the background, but one of the things that I did was to look at the 2008 auction of 700 megahertz spectrum to see what lessons we can take away from that as the FCC designs the auctions this year. And there are a couple of critical lessons, I think. One of them is that you really do need to have the auction open to all bidders who might want to come in. And the reason for that is that you really don't know who's going to show up. There was tremendous hope that Frontline Wireless would bid for the D block and build it out, but because of the financial crisis between the time when the rules were created for the auction and the auction itself, Frontline couldn't get funding, they weren't able to participate, and the D block never sold to anyone else. Sprint and T-Mobile both sat out that auction, so if you had not had AT&T and Verizon participating, you would not have sold most of the spectrum. And you certainly would not have had anywhere near the kind of proceeds you had. Now, what is to me really fascinating, looking back at the statistics of auction 73, the 700 megahertz auction, is that the small players not only were not crowded out, but they did extremely well in the auction. Participants who accounted for less than 10% of the industry's market share wound up getting 28% of the spectrum, and they only paid 14% of the proceeds for that. So they got a disproportionate amount of the spectrum at a very low price. To me, again, that says you really don't know who's going to show up. So open the doors wide and make the spectrum available to the folks who really want it. The other lesson of that, as Philip said more articulately than I can, is Verizon and AT&T have gone on to build out that spectrum very quickly. And that's clearly what you want. You don't want the spectrum sort of sitting on the shelf where it really doesn't benefit consumers at all. The end game here is to make greater bandwidth available to every consumer. And that means putting it in the hands of folks who are willing to invest in it. And the final point for me that was fascinating in looking at the auction results was to look at the impact that conditions had on the price at which the spectrum was sold. The FCC had reserve prices indicated an expectation that the spectrum would sell at a very tight range of valuation between 41 cents and 74 cents per megahertz per unit of population. In fact, the range wound up being 0 obviously for the D block, but 17 cents nominally for the 1 bid that Qualcomm made for the D block, up to $2.68 for the B block, which had no conditions attached. The spectrum that had no interference and no conditions sold for more than 4 times what the C block that Verizon did buy sold for. So clearly, and there were basically very few, I mean, Verizon was the only serious bidder for that block because of the open access condition. So there was a tremendous amount of debate on the Hill on these aspects of auction design. And it seems to me when you look back at the case study that is the 700 megahertz auction, that the lessons are pretty clear. You really do need to make sure everyone participates. You need to make sure you put it in the hands of parties that are actually going to invest in it. And for the sake of the American taxpayer, you want to make sure that you get the best price you can for it, and that means you're not putting conditions on it. Questions, or Chris? Please.
We're up against 10:30.
Right.
Promise people at the end of 10:30, but I know we have a few minutes if folks want to ask a few questions of the panel. Yep.
Hi, Juliana, the Commission Journal again. This question is for Philip. Do you agree that the next step is they're going to have to take a serious look at federal spectrum and bring up some of that, the spectrum being used by federal agencies and ways to free up more of that?
Well, we certainly believe that more spectrum is good, and you heard a lot about that today from many more prestigious sources than me. I focus my time on making the best use of our upper C spectrum and leasing that out to rural operators to make sure that they can take advantage of that. But certainly we know as we think about our rural carriers, they're going to need access to more spectrum. And we fully intend to use our other spectrum assets, for example, AWS spectrum that we may have now or in the future, and make that available to them as well so that they can grow and continue to expand their businesses. Because we know in very densely populated portions of these rural markets, they will have capacity needs. So yes, I would say we are interested in more spectrum, absolutely.
Hi, Lynn Stanton, Telecommunications Reports. Do you think the FCC will and or should provide complete flexibility in how carriers or entities that bid for the reclaimed broadcast spectrum can use it?
I don't know that I'm really capable of answering that particular question about broadcast spectrum. Again, my point today in coming was to talk more about our rural development efforts on the spectrum that we do have. And certainly, the upper C is a good spectrum for offering LTE, and rural carriers recognize that and are going to act quickly to put it to use. I'll defer to my colleagues to maybe answer your question more directly.
Well, certainly you've had Commissioner McDowell advocating for unlicensed use for years. I think there's some room that the bill left for the FCC to allow for some flexibility, so we'll see.
Good morning, Tim Robinson with Congressman Bobby Rush. Dr. Kovacs, this may be a little bit pedantic of a question, but have you looked at what the opportunity costs might have amounted to had AT&T and Verizon not participated in the 2008 auctions? And what do they amount to?
One way to approach that is to look at the prices that were paid by AT&T and Verizon as opposed to the smaller carriers. And the average price per megahertz pop paid by the small carriers was 64 cents per megahertz pop. The price paid on average by AT&T and Verizon was $1.51, and that includes the C block, which sold probably way below potential market value because there was no competition for it because of the open access condition. So, you know, 2.5 times, but taking the actual numbers, they paid 2.5 times what the small players did. So if you had sold all of this spectrum for 64 cents per megahertz pop, you would have raised less than $9 billion instead of $19 billion. But that's an optimistic assumption because the small players would not have bought it all, certainly would not have bought it all at that price. So I think we would have left on the table something between 10 and $15 billion.
Dr. Kovacs, this is a
Yes.
question for you. Good to see you again.
And you,
I had a question in regards to your, about your analysis of the 700 megahertz auction and the conditions that were applied. I mean, what are your thoughts about some of the other countries that are auctioned or have auctioned spectrum over the past several years that have, either done set-asides, kind of spur new entrants to participate, as well as, I think even the French applied conditions where if a carrier didn't win a bid, they could get a data roaming agreement, with one of the winning bidders, or a bidder that agreed to have an MVNO right on the, share of the spectrum would actually get a bidding credit or preference for the bid. So, I mean, I'm not advocating any of that, but I'm just saying that some of these other countries are doing some different things to try to spur competition, healthy competition. I just want to get your thoughts on that, if that's something that the FCC should look to in designing future auctions or not.
well, a number of those things we actually do have in place. We have discounts for designated entities, which I think is one of the things you were talking about. The FCC has rules on roaming that they have made more extensive fairly recently. So I think we're doing a lot of the things already through existing rules, and the kind of conditions that I was looking at, I think, go way beyond and really make spectrum unappealing. The intent, I think, can be good, but at the end of the day, I think what benefits consumers most is if you do actually get the spectrum out. You don't want to wind up in the kind of situation we had with the D block, for example, where spectrum has sat on the shelf now for 4 or 5 years. So I think you want to be pretty careful with what you try and do through auction design versus what you do through the general rules that the FCC can pass through their normal NPRM process.
And maybe I could add that, as part of the rural program that I described, we have 15 data roaming agreements in place. These operators can roam from day one on our network, and we will roam on their networks, and they can roam amongst each other. So that was well underway when we originally designed the program back in 2010.
And I guess just one final point, having looked at companies' results coming in through the last few weeks, I mean, one of the things that's striking is the enormous number of wholesale customers that the large carriers are pointing. So we clearly have a viable commercial wholesale situation in this country.
Just a follow on to the thoughts that the auctions should be confined to bidders that have existing subscribers. I think that thought was put out. If we're arguing also for spectrum flexibility, is that presupposition a good one to make, or should that be one of the tickets for entering the bidding room.
I very much appreciate you raising that question, because that, I did not mean to say that. If it sounded like I did, then I apologize. I think the auctions need to be open to everyone. You've got Google, for example, sitting with $45 billion of cash on their balance sheet. There's no reason why they could not become a great competitor in this industry if they decided to go into the network business. That's a good way to get competition. So I think the point is, it should be open to absolutely anyone who is capable financially and operationally of executing once they get the spectrum. What I was saying is, it's important not to exclude anyone who would like to participate. That's the only point I was trying to make.
And Mr. Ehrig, is that the right pronunciation? You talked about table stakes being broadband connectivity, but you also ticked off some other variables that were also important. If we're to replicate some of what you did in Russell County around the country, are any of those variables, as you see it, just really critical?
Absolutely. I think aside from broadband, which again, if you don't have broadband connectivity, wireless connectivity, if I can't connect to the global grid 24/7, you won't get the jobs in that area. It just won't happen. So aside from that, I think one of the secret sauces that people don't realize is it's not just throwing up a building and say, hey, I got a center here. You have to have a real partnership between the state and local politics. You have to have the involvement of the academic communities, because you're trying to weave yourself into the fabric of that community. Because to get 450 high-tech, white-collar jobs for college graduates coming from community colleges and smaller colleges, you have to be able to influence the curriculum. You have to make sure that you have the word out and everybody's working in lockstep, because I could rapidly run out of those people if we don't do it right. So it's not just about putting up a building and declaring, hey, I've got jobs here. You've got to plan out and really be integrated in that community, because typically there aren't that many high-tech jobs in that community. So you're kind of seeding it, and you're having to take those raw materials, as I said, those human minds, and trying to identify them early while they're in college, affect their curriculum, so when they get out, they have the basic skills that you can use in this high-tech industry.
Any questions? Okay, great. Well, thank you all very much for coming. Thanks to our panel for their insight. It's very helpful. And thank you all.